Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you today to bring you another author interview. I am speaking today with author Sam Bleicher about his new novel, The Plot to Cool the Planet. It's a book about climate change. It's a mystery. It's an interesting collection of genres. Let me actually just read you the back of the book. It's set slightly in the future, so June 2020. An outspoken climate scientist is murdered. Investigators believe she was assassinated to end her forceful advocacy for untested geoengineering techniques that might slow global warming. Frequent extreme storms and rising sea levels are undermining the viability of coastal cities. Millions of subsistence farmers and fishermen are facing ruin as crop yields fall and fisheries disappear. No nation is volunteering to take in climate refugees. Frustrated by the global paralysis, 3 small island diplomats secretly launch a rogue venture to cool the planet. The odds of success are low, and the threat to their careers and lives is tangible, but they feel morally obligated to try. Their project uncovers other surreptitious interventions, causing perilous political, diplomatic, and military confrontations. So, it's this, like I said, it's this fascinating combination of genres where you've got this mystery of who murdered the climate scientist, and that jumps in right away. That's in the first part of the book. You meet her. She is on a cruise, traveling under an assumed identity to maintain her anonymity because she is a public figure. She is murdered. Several days later, the person who assassinated her is murdered, so you jump into this mystery. And then her death really is a catalyst for other parts of the book. You've got that mystery, but then you've also got the 3 diplomats who are trying to figure out how to save their island nations from being swamped, basically, from being drowned by rising sea levels. They are frustrated with the political process that is not moving at any pace that might be helpful, and they decide to take matters into their own hands. So you've got mystery, you've got intrigue, there's a little bit of romance, you've got it's not exactly science fiction, it's fiction about science, but not science fiction in the way that you would think, because the science is all real. It's set slightly in the future, but not far enough in the future that it is, that kind of science fiction. So it's just, like I said, it's this fascinating combination of genres. I learned a lot from this book. There are parts of it that do read a bit like a climate change report, but, in the context of the book as you're reading. So you'll learn a lot of facts. If you're interested in climate change, then this is definitely a book that you can read and learn a lot from, but also enjoy in terms of the plot and the characters and the mystery, etc. So if you are interested in this book, I do have copies to give away. Just stay tuned until the end of the episode, and you will find out how to win a copy of The Plot to Cool the Planet by Sam Bleicher. In the meantime, let's go ahead and turn to that interview with Sam.
Hi, Sam. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
I am as well, and we are here to talk about your new book, The Plot to Cool the Planet. But before we talk about the book, I would love to just get to know you a little bit, have my listeners get to know you. So if you could share a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Yes, it's hard to know where to begin because I'm now retired and I've done a variety of things in life. I've been a law professor I was a law professor for about a decade. I was a state government official for 6 or 7 years. I was a federal government official for 7 or 8 years, actually. And in between, I practiced law in Washington, in the Washington metropolitan area. You can either say I'm good at everything, or you can say jack of all trades, master of none. But it's been a very good experience in the sense that I have seen the world from a lot of different perspectives. And one of the things I've come to realize from that is how many people get into one job and stay at it, and they only see the world from that one perspective. And it's very narrowing in some ways. I don't think I've had any job for more than 10 years. So that's an indication of what I've been doing over the last, since I graduated from law school in 1966. It's a long time ago already.
Okay. Thank you so much. Again, the book is called The Plot to Cool the Planet. It came out on Earth Day. Can you tell us a little bit about the story?
The story is really two stories, in part because I didn't want the book to be a lecture on climate change. Part of the reason to write a novel was that I wanted to interest people who would otherwise not read a report on climate change. The first part of the story is about a young female climate scientist who feels the stress of her work and escapes on cruises using a false name. And she meets a man, and it turns out that the man was sent to assassinate her, and he does. And that's the beginning of the book. And a significant part of the book is devoted to the effort to track down the people who really supported this effort, who paid for this assassination. Where did this money come from? Because it was clearly a very professional job. And it turns out that within a few days after the assassination, the individual, the man who actually did it, also dies and turns out to have been murdered. And that part of the story follows two Canadian investigators as they try to piece together what happened and find the ultimate authorization for the assassination. So that's one piece of the story. The other part is about one diplomat to start with, who encourages a couple of friends who come from small island states that are about to be drowned by rising sea levels, to just forget about all the international procedures and all the stuff that they have worked on all their lives and do something completely outside of the system. See if they can get some money and see if they can get a physical location to conduct a solar geoengineering project that they hope will slow down, perhaps even reverse, the climate changes that we are experiencing, including the rising sea levels. Of course, it can't be entirely reversed. A lot of what is going to happen over the next few decades is already baked in, as they say. That is, that increase in temperature is going to occur, and it really can't be stopped in the short run. And the question is whether we can do anything to slow it down and mitigate the effects by dimming the sun, basically, through solar geoengineering projects. That idea is very controversial, and for good reason, because there are real questions about the scope of the effect. There are real technical questions about what levels of effort we make. How much is the right amount of dimming? How much of the chemicals we spread in the atmosphere are necessary to get the right result, as opposed to overshooting or having no effect at all. And so it's a complicated it's a complicated question. We don't have good answers, and there's no way to really conduct significant experiments to get the answer because we don't have any planet to experiment with. So
right.
It's a dangerous thing in that sense. On the other hand, if you believe some of the predictions that we are hearing, or most of the predictions we're hearing as time goes on, we have a very grim future awaiting us if we don't do anything. So, so that's what the book is about. And then I should add, once this project gets underway and others discover it exists, it becomes a major international controversy between the United States and Russia in particular, but with other countries also very much interested in the outcome.
What's interesting, I think, about the book is that you mentioned that you wanted to write a novel to encourage people who might not read, a scientific report on climate change. But so the genres of the book are, it's a little bit science fiction, it's a little bit climate change report, it's a little bit mystery, it's a little bit intrigue and suspense. So you really kind of got a lot of different genres in there that might draw in different types of readers, which I was impressed by.
Well, yes, I discovered when I started looking at contests and other questions about the book, even on Amazon, for example, there's a categorization. What do you want this book to be called? Well, to call it science fiction, since all of the science, as far as I know, is real, is not really accurate. To call it fantasy is even less accurate. Some people use the term speculative fiction, meaning things that are set in the future. Some have called them alternate fiction, as in alternate universe kinds of things. But unlike most science fiction, there is no suspension of gravity or time or other elements like that. It's just simply looking forward and hypothesizing what might happen, what people might do, basically.
And you mentioned speculative fiction kind of set in the future. It is set in the future, but not, it's set in 2020. It starts so can you talk a little bit about your decision to set it just barely into the future?
Yes, of course, the further you set it in the future, the more unreal it becomes. When I started writing it in 2017. I was thinking about it in 2016. And so it was further away when I started thinking about it. And part of the realism of the book comes from the fact that Vladimir Putin is still president of the Soviet Union, of Russia, I should say, at this time. And Xi Jinping is still the president of China. Donald Trump is not still the president of the United States. And much of the structure of government hasn't changed a lot. The kinds of things that people are fighting about climate change haven't changed a lot. And that way it can be realistic. If I had said it in 2030, I would be making all sorts of assumptions about the path of the whole world that would be less and less believable, maybe. And there's another reason which I said it at that time frame, because the kinds of activity that can make a difference are really activities that should be done in the coming half decade. So the idea of solar geoengineering making a difference depends in part upon when it's done. It's got to be done soon, or it loses its effectiveness.
Let's talk a little bit about the three protagonists who, starts out with the one diplomat who encourages others to join him. Talk about the diplomats, and what about their characters and their plot to cool the planet? What about them do you think will resonate with readers?
Well, I think they're realistic people. I think they are. They turn out to be risk takers. Unlike most diplomats and unlike most government officials and bureaucrats, they decide to do something that really violates all the norms of their profession because they think they've got to do it. And they are very much aware of that fact, and they decide to go forward. And at various points, one or the other of them has real doubts about whether this is something they should even be associated with, because there are risks, especially when it turns out that the Russian government is unhappy with what they're doing. That becomes evident later in the book. So in that sense, they are professionals. They, like a lot of professionals that we know, and they have an ethic of their profession, and it involves following the rules and following the procedures. Particularly for small countries, that's, as is mentioned a couple of times in the book, small countries depend on the United Nations and the World Trade Organization and agreements on diplomatic immunity and all as their protection, because the truth is they can't really defend themselves militarily or any other way if somebody really wants to take them over. And so they have a lot at stake when they think about ignoring the established procedures for making government decisions and making decisions that affect everybody in the world. But that's what they decide to do because they are that desperate, basically.
I'm going to jump in here so we can take our first break of the podcast, but now you have an idea, a better idea of what this book is about and some of the characters involved. When we come back, we're going to be talking more about all of those genres that I mentioned earlier. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Sam Bleicher about his book, The Plot to Cool the Planet. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
You mentioned at the beginning that there's the mystery and the one climate change scientist is murdered, but in a way she continues to be a character throughout the book because her influence in the climate change community in other circles is so intense. She still continues to be a force even after her death, maybe because of her death. So she continues to be a character throughout the book. Can you talk a little bit about her influence on the story?
Well, yes, she was outspoken about the need to do something immediately and more seriously than what the established organizations are talking about. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, started out with the question, well, what do we have to do to avoid disaster in 2100? And the difficulty with that was, and still is to some degree, that they are not looking at short-run impacts. They're sort of assuming a smooth increase in temperature over the period to 2100. And they aren't recognizing that some things that are happening right now, like the melting of the glaciers and the effects on agricultural productivity and the effects on the ocean and fisheries, are irreversible changes. And the fact that we can we can manage to bring the temperature back to a stable point at 2 degrees above our current average temperature, is a physicist's way of looking at it, but it's not a biologist's way of looking at it. It's not a sociologist's way or a political scientist's way. And what Dr. Halverson says, I think persuasively, of course I wrote what she said, is that the immediate impacts are going to be so substantial that it won't matter what happens in 2100 if we don't do some things now to avoid some of the more immediate consequences. In fact, I was just reading today about a group in England called the Extinction Rebellion, which is basically saying that. It's basically saying we need to do something right now. It isn't a problem for our children or our grandchildren. It's a problem for us. And that underlying all that is society and our economic institutions, our agricultural institutions, our trade relations, and all of that are much more fragile than people assume. And if they're damaged, it's very hard to put it back together again. And if we start having droughts and floods in 2 different places, of course, and temperatures that turn normal growing areas into deserts, that will have permanent impacts that can't be undone, and society will not survive. Civilization will crumble in parts of the world as a result of what's happening right now. Not a very happy perspective, I'm afraid, but I think a realistic one, and one that the scientific experts, the meteorologists and climate scientists, analysts have understated, partly because they don't want to be called alarmist, and partly because they're scientists and they're not sure that things are bad. They're just expecting that they're bad.
This is obviously a topic that you are very passionate about. What kinds of research did you do for the book?
For the book specifically, I started reading more about geoengineering and what it involves and what it would take, because in the book the project is set up and the question is, well, what do you need? You need airplanes, you need chemicals, you need are you going to have pilots, or are you going to use drones, and so on. But I've been teaching courses in climate change for several years now, mostly overseas, in China, and I've lectured in India and in other countries. So in doing that work, I have done the research, in effect, that underlies most of what's in the book. So it wasn't that I needed to do a lot of research about climate change. It was more about thinking about how to make it into a book, into a novel that would get people's attention.
What do you hope that readers will take away from the book?
Well, first of all, I hope they'll enjoy reading it. That's the first step, because if they don't enjoy reading it, it won't be seen by enough people. Second, I think the message, the science in the book is that we're not dealing with a healthy planet that we can sit back and let run the way it has over the past 10,000 years or so, and we'll be fine. We have done things, and it isn't just fossil fuels. It's agriculture, it's artificial fertilizers, it's population growth, it's all of these factors that have already significantly changed the planet. If you want to say re-engineered, I think that's a legitimate way of saying it. We have dramatically increased life expectancy, which is a wonderful thing for those of us who are alive, but which changes the whole structure of the whole demographics of human presence on the planet. And we doubled the population of the Earth in the past 30 or 40 years, I guess. And our agriculture is completely artificial in the sense that the fertilizers we use and the chemicals we use to produce our food are made out of oil and natural gas, and that is not a natural, balanced phenomenon. So the complex relationships between temperature and times when plants bloom and times when butterflies and birds show up in various places, and the times when fish show up in various places because of the temperature of the water and the flow of the water, have all been changed by human activity. And we haven't realized how much we are making use of resources that are irreplaceable, and how much we are creating imbalances that we don't really know how to fix in the short run. The message is a serious one, and I hope people will take that away from the book, that this is a matter that really does deserve attention. It's not something we can wish away. It's not something we can work at over time. In fact, one of the problems in dealing with climate change is that a lot of people are still operating on an understanding of where we are that is about 10 or 15 years old now, which is that we've got plenty of time to work all this out. The whole idea of using more natural gas to replace coal is that natural gas involves much less carbon emission than coal does, which is fine, except that we've now reached the point where the natural gas is a danger in itself. The emission of methane is causing the short-run problems, and the goal, according to the IPCC, is that we've got to have a net zero emission of carbon from human activities. Well, that's not what people were saying 10 years ago, and the solutions from 10 years ago were, well, we should use more natural gas and less coal, and that isn't really a solution.
Interesting, and a little bleak, maybe. So from your perspective, then, what are some of the things that the average person can do on a day-to-day basis to help combat climate change?
Well, there are lots of things at various levels. So first of all, the politics of climate change are that there are many places in the world, including the United States right now, where the people in charge of the government are refusing to acknowledge that there's a problem. Arguments, even for those who say there is a problem, the argument is, well, it's too expensive to fix, basically. It will cost a lot of money. Well, compared to what? And compared to the Earth becoming uninhabitable, that's a kind of approach that is basically, just give up, completely defeatist. And I don't think we've reached that point yet. And we certainly ought to be giving it a try. Yes, it'll be expensive. It's expensive in some senses, but in some other senses, it's not expensive. People who are hostile to this are saying, well, we're going to have to build all these new power plants and stop using all these old power plants. And it is true, we have a lot of investment in coal mines, in pipelines, in coal power plants, and natural gas power plants that we're going to have to abandon. We're going to have to replace them with something else. That's going to have an effect. But so are the natural processes of business as usual. We have more storms. We have more rebuilding to do. We have rising sea levels. We have to spend money to protect our cities so they don't drown. That doesn't improve anybody's sort of daily real standard of living. That's just preserving what we have. So there's that level of activity where people need to be involved politically to make it clear to the government that, yes, something's got to be done, and it needs to be done now, and it's not something to put off. Individually, well, the less the less energy we use, the less fossil fuel we use, the better. So I'm a believer in electric cars. I have actually two, and I think that that's something that the auto industry is saying. Well, we don't know if people are going to buy electric cars. We don't know how fast we can sell them. But the reality is that they are not in any hurry because they have huge investments in factories that make transmissions and internal combustion engines that they won't need, that don't work anymore, that aren't part of an electric car. So the public has got to make the industry know that, yes, we want to buy these cars. People need to go and buy them to the extent that they are in the market for a car. Obviously, saving energy, using less by improving insulation in houses and office buildings. It sounds silly to say turning off electric lights, but yes, especially when in times of high demand, minimizing your electricity use is important. We need to be open to the changes that have to be made, and that's another thing that's a problem. People don't want solar power in their backyard any more than they want any other kind of power plant in their backyard, but they have to be built someplace. And the power lines have to be built someplace if we're going to have, if we're going to preserve our civilization the way it is. So being open-minded to that kind of change is important. In the whole field of food and agriculture, a large part of carbon emissions from the planet come from animals. And so I hate to sound like being a vegan is going to solve the problem, but eating less red meat, eating less beef in particular, is a step that people can take. It's good for their health and all the other stuff, but it's also reducing emissions if we can get people, large numbers of people, to eat less meat. It will mean we'll have less agricultural activity in that field. Those are the kinds of steps. Of course, everybody talks about plastics, and plastics are a big problem in a lot of ways, but I don't think plastics are a contributor to climate change the way cows are. Plastics are a problem because we make things out of plastic, and the plastic just lasts forever. Now we're discovering that it breaks up into tiny particles that we can't even see, and it ends up in our water supply, and it ends up in the water, in the oceans, and it ends up in the water supply of every living thing. We don't know how much difference that's going to make. There isn't a lot of science, as far as I'm aware, that shows that is absolutely poisonous. It's hard to see how it's good for you, though, and it's certainly not the way humans and animals and plants have evolved over the last 100,000 years to live in the environment we're living in. So, it's not a good thing. But changing the way we produce electricity is a big part of the step, a big part of the activity, and finding ways to grow crops without as much artificial fertilizer and without as much runoff, so that the fertilizer that's used is kept where it should be used instead of just washing away every time it rains, are important steps.
And I am going to interrupt once again so we can take our second and final break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be speaking more with Sam, finding out about his own writing process, some advice he might have, where you can find him on the internet, all those good things. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion to my interview with author Sam Bleicher about his new novel, The Plot to Cool the Planet. This is obviously something that you have thought a lot about, researched, done a lot of work on. In terms of the writing process, then, it sounds like you've written throughout your career. But when it comes to writing fiction specifically, had you always wanted to write fiction, or did you decide to write a novel specifically based on this topic? How did you come to write this novel?
I did write a novel before this. It's called Appointments. It's available on Amazon. I self-published it, and it never really took off. It's a Washington novel. I guess I should go back to the beginning. When I read Bonfire of the Vanities, Tom Wolfe's book, I thought to myself, that's a New York story. There should be a Washington story just like it, where we write about people pursuing their particular ambitions and interacting in ways that affect each other not necessarily well. And that's the kind of a book I thought of when I thought about writing. And I had thought that when I read Bonfire of the Vanities, which was, 20, 25 years ago. And I always had that in the back of my head. And the first book I wrote was about, this book, Appointments, is about a Southern senator who wants to become an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and how he indirectly strikes a deal with a candidate for president who he thinks is going to appoint him to the Supreme Court. And when he doesn't get appointed right away, things happen then. And then when he does finally get appointed, things come out about his background that raise problems. I won't go into greater detail than that, but it's rather explosive. And that was my first attempt to do that. And of course, after I wrote the book, I learned a lot more about writing books, about writing novels. I started reading about writing novels, and I started thinking about what makes novels appealing. And this topic is a topic that I care about, but it also reflects the same kind of speculative fiction. Yes, I have written all my life, but lawyers are taught to write straightforward declarative sentences and leave out the emotions. That's what you're taught in law school, all right? Just try to pull apart all the facts and figure out what is going on and what is the rule that should apply to it and why it should be this way or as opposed to that way. Writing a novel about people's feelings and emotions is a very different thing. I think that I've done a better job of that in this novel, and you may have noticed that one of the techniques I used here, which was something I just recently sort of learned about, was to use italics when people were thinking things as opposed to saying them out loud. So when you have things that are in italics, that's what somebody's thinking to himself or herself. And it makes it much easier to deal with. You don't have to say he thought to himself every time somebody is thinking to himself about something. And And I don't know if it's widely used or not, but when I realized that was something, that was an alternative, that things in ordinary quotation marks were things people said, and things that were in italics were things people thought, that that device by itself made writing so much easier. And I enjoyed the writing. I certainly enjoyed putting the story together, and trying to start with some ideas and let them grow, you might say. And as I say, it's a completely different kind of writing from what you do for a legal brief, where the one thing you know for sure is the conclusion you want to reach, because you represent one client or the other. But here, I start with some sort of turn on the machine. All right, I see with this, the climate scientist has been murdered. The investigators start investigating, and what do they find, and where do they go? And the same thing with the solar geoengineering. These couple of diplomats recognize they've got a serious problem, and that the world isn't solving, and they start thinking about how they're going to get something done about it, and the story grows on its own in that way. There are a couple of love interests in the book, as is real, in terms of what happens in the real world. And writing about something like that is very different from writing a legal brief.
I would imagine.
Out of your unique experience in coming to writing a novel, then, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Well, my advice to aspiring authors don't do what I did. That's one of the things I would say. I mean, everybody says, and I guess they're probably right, that you really should have a pretty carefully constructed outline of what you're going to do in your book. And I didn't do that, as I was explaining a minute ago. I sort of turned on the machine, created the situation, and let it play itself out. The result may be that my book is longer than it should be, and that some parts have more emphasis than they deserve. But once you put yourself in the position of this individual and start thinking about what they're going to do, things evolve in ways that take longer explanation, and that are interesting in themselves. So that's one comment I would make. You really should plan out the book better than I have done. Second, the most important thing is to start writing. I have friends who say, gee, mostly they're thinking about writing memoirs. And I keep telling them the way you start is to start. You start making your outline, you start identifying things you want to talk about, and you start writing the pieces, and you see how they come together. Some of the larger picture elements emerge as you're doing it. So if you don't start, you never get there. And that's the other advice I would give. In fact, years ago, I read a statement by a writer who said, if you want to be a writer, the first thing you need to do is sit down in a room and not do anything. Just sit there and think about things. And see if you can do that. Because if you can't do that, you're not going to be able to write. You've got to be able to have the discipline and the patience to sit down and do it. And that's part of the discipline. Now, in some ways, writing novels is easier than doing the work I was doing before, because when you're writing a legal brief, or when you're reading a scientific paper, you can't say anything without a footnote, without a support for what you're saying, piece of evidence or an article or something. I don't have that problem with a novel. I mean, in fact, in my first novel, I said something took place. I said Justice Black was nominated for the Supreme Court, and it came out that he had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and that might have killed his chances. And someone corrected me on that and said, well, that didn't come out till after he was appointed, and there was talk about removing him from the court because, which is a very different context politically and legally. No one's been removed from the Supreme Court in our history. And my answer was, well, my character thought that it came up before he was nominated, before Black was nominated. So my client, my character in the book had a mistaken recollection of the facts. You can get away with that in a novel. You can't get away with that in a scientific paper or in a legal paper. So in that sense, it's easier writing. And when you're writing about how people feel and what they say when emotionally laden things happen, is another, you make that up. You reflect your experience with real people. And that's easier to do than writing nonfiction.
And when you're not writing and you take time to read, do you have favorite authors or genres that you tend to turn to?
When I take time to read, when I'm not reading the newspaper and reading the latest reports on climate change and other stuff that I'm working on, first of all, I'm a bit of a political junkie, so I'm reading the newspaper about what's going on presidential campaigns and Senate campaigns and all the time. But I'm a member of a book club. I'm a member of two groups, actually, that are interesting. One of them is a book club, a traditional book club. Nearly all of what we read is U.S. history. We vote every year on books that we're going to read in the future. We always end up reading U.S. history, which is interesting, but it's not really changing anybody's mind about anything. We're reading about Jefferson. We're reading about Washington. We're reading about Lincoln. Reading about Roosevelt. Having benefited from a pretty good high school education in American history, I'm not seeing new things. It isn't changing my whole outlook on the world. But they're well-written books. So that's one group. Another group I'm in is called a Meeting of Minds, which is consciously not a book club. It is a group discussion of issues. And usually the discussion is built around a couple of magazine articles. It involves a lot less reading, but it involves a lot more controversial issues. We had a discussion on immigration last month. We're having a discussion on affirmative action this month. And so we've had those kinds of issues. And the group of people is reasonably homogeneous, but we have not just lawyers, we have some doctors and we have some business people. And that makes a difference in terms of, we have a couple of psychiatrists in the group. So those people bring a different perspective to the discussion. So there's reading of that kind that is not a whole book on immigration issues, but a long paper on immigration issues, something out of the Atlantic or something out of the New Yorker or something out of a Sunday Times magazine. And that is in some ways more stimulating because we usually end up finding a couple of articles that disagree with each other, which is more challenging and makes you think. What have I been reading lately? There's a book called The 2020 Report on the North Korean Attack on the United States, which is nuclear attack on the United States, which is an interesting speculative fiction, in particularly because, as a counterexample to my book, the commission report is written like a commission report, like a government commission report. And although the author manages to get in a few clever lines, it's not, it doesn't have the excitement because it doesn't have the human element to the same degree that my novels do. and it doesn't reflect their internal emotions. It's a report. And so the concept limits the scope of the writing. So that's most of the kind of reading I'm doing. I ran across a book called Eternal Life, which I stumbled across in my synagogue library when I was there one day. It's classic science fiction. These two people basically made a deal with the devil that they would have eternal life in order to avoid certain consequences. And it's been a couple of thousand years, and they're getting tired of it. And it's a question of what they do now, and how they deal with the fact that they're not going to die, and they don't get older the way their families do, and over the years they've left many people behind. So it makes for a different kind of a science fiction.
Thank you for that. I believe you have a website, so tell people what the website is and also where they can find you on social media if they're interested in following you.
Yes. The book has a Facebook page, The Plot to Cool the Planet, which I post things on. Well, I've posted, for example, that I'm going to do this interview. So I don't know when people will find it, but I hope they do. And then I have a Twitter account. It's at Bleicher Sam A, which is largely devoted to the book and climate change. And what I'm finding is that people are as interested in the facts of climate change as they are in the novel.
Well, it sounds like people can learn a lot from following you on social media, from going to your website, etc. Sam, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your weekend to talk to me about your book. The book is The Plot to Cool the Planet. It is available now, so if you are interested, you should definitely check it out. Sam, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you once again to Sam for joining me to talk about his new novel, The Plot to Cool the Planet. Thank you, as always, my listeners. You know how much I appreciate you. If you are interested in climate change, if you like a good mystery, if you like some suspense and international intrigue, then you might be interested in The Plot to Cool the Planet. You are in luck because, as I said at the beginning, I have copies to give away. It's very easy to enter this giveaway. All you have to do is go to our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, GSMC Book Review social media pages. Those links are in the show description of this episode. And comment on this episode. This is episode 153, interview with Sam Bleicher. Just make a comment and you will be entered to win a copy of that book. We would love it if you would follow our pages, like the post, share the posts, all those wonderful social media kinds of things. But in order to enter the giveaway, you do have to comment on one of those posts. So Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, GSMC Book Review, episode 53, interview with Sam Bleicher. Thank you so much. I hope you do enter and win this great novel. Thank you again to Sam. Thank you to you, my readers. I hope you're having a great week, and I hope that you take some time to go out there and get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.